Hello and welcome to the fifth and final UEA postgraduate research seminar of the semester. We're a hybrid seminar series, so we'd like to welcome both our online audience and our audience in the room, and also our speakers who are also joining us online tonight. From the University of Nottingham, we've got Natalie Grace, and from the University of Sheffield, we've got Hannah Slack. We're going to start with Natalie first tonight. Natalie is a final year history PhD student at the University of Nottingham, funded by the AHRC Midlands4Cities DTP. Her thesis is a comparative study of witchcraft in popular print in early modern Germany and England, exploring demonology, crime and criminality, gender and identity, and space and place. And she's also recently published an article called Vermin and Devil Worshippers, exploring witch identities in popular print in early modern Germany and England in the Midlands Historical Review. So Natalie, I will hand straight over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Louise. I'm just going to try and share my slides. Let's see if it works. Here we go. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Louise, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. My paper today compares discourses surrounding weather magic in printed sources in Germany and England. It argues that weather magic is a useful lens to understand contemporary demonological debates, and it also, by comparing two countries, contributes to wider historiographical discussions about the significance of climate variations in shaping the locations and severity of witch hunting. So this particular case study, looking at weather magic and storms and all this kind of thing, it's not going to feature in my thesis itself, but I'm hoping potentially to maybe turn it into an article or something further down the line. So yeah, I'd really appreciate any feedback or comments that you've got. So before I get into sort of the main discussion, I wanted to just briefly outline the comparative context of my research. Witchcraft research has been dominated by regional studies, particularly in Germany, but also to a lesser extent in England. This approach is logical, especially in Germany, or more properly the Holy Roman Empire, which was at this time decentralized, fragmented, and composed of roughly 2,000 semi-independent territories of varying size. Significant regional variations in the scale and severity of witch hunting mean that some locations have lent themselves to particularly detailed case studies, whereas in other areas the sources are fairly sparse. Anglophone studies of German witchcraft have, for example, focused almost exclusively on the southern territories of the empire. Such regional analysis has been invaluable for revealing the complex dynamics of witch hunting. But historians are increasingly highlighting the need for new approaches which move beyond this regional perspective. In his historiographical review of German witchcraft, Thomas Robichaud suggested that comparative history was a methodology which might yield useful results. In his review of English witchcraft, Malcolm Gaskill made the same point. So a key aim of my thesis is to explore how comparing these two countries can enrich our understanding of witchcraft and potentially provide a new framework for further research. So on the face of it, witch hunting in Germany and England could not have been more different. Around 25,000 people were executed, mostly by burning, for the crime of witchcraft in Germany. And this figure equates to roughly half of the total witchcraft executions in Europe, despite the fact that Germany at this time only accounted for around 20% of Europe's population. England, on the other hand, has generally been considered mild in its treatment of witches and hanged around 500 people for the crime. German witchcraft's also traditionally been considered to be more associated with devil worship and diabolism, whereas English witchcraft has traditionally been portrayed as more concerned with harmful magic. Approaches to witch hunting also differed significantly. In England, prosecutions tended to focus on individuals or family groups of witches. In Germany, however, trials in some locations, such as the Electorate of Trier or the Electorate of Cologne, quickly spiralled out of control. The use of torture and the arrest of suspects who were named during these interrogations contributed to these large-scale chain reaction hunts where hundreds and sometimes thousands of individuals were killed within the space of a few years. A shared characteristic, however, and one that's quite important for me, is the interest that witchcraft generated in the printing industries of Germany and England. Witchcraft appeared in numerous printed sources, including ballads, news reports, sermons, religious tracts, and of course demonologies. I'm not going to be looking at demonologies particularly today, and I'm not really looking at those in my thesis either, just because I think they've been explored very extensively and very well elsewhere. So what I want to do is look at some of these sources that have received potentially less attention. And I'm also particularly interested in so-called popular print sources which may have reached a much wider audience than the demonological treatises did. So then the next question is, why bother looking at weather magic? Why am I looking at this? My interest in weather magic stems from my master's research, which examined the validity of confessionalization and acculturation theories through analysis of German witchcraft sermons that were printed between 1530 and 1630. While conducting this research, I was struck by the recurrence of one question: is it possible for a witch to conjure a storm? Preachers returned to this question throughout the 16th and 17th century, and extreme weather events seem to have been the impetus for new sermons which discussed the connection between sorcery and storms. Weather magic was a way for preachers to engage their audience in wider discussions of the relative power of God, the devil, and the devil's minions, also known as witches. Weather and weather magic also feature prominently in historians' explanations for the witch hunts. So Wolfgang Behringer puts forward the argument that witch hunting was connected to climate variations caused by the Little Ice Age and the resulting agrarian crises. Witchcraft, according to Behringer, served as an explanation for the widespread suffering which was caused by said crises. And Behringer's argument is particularly significant because it offers a supranational explanation for the variations in witch hunting. So the idea essentially is that territories which were most affected by the agrarian crises are also the ones that participated in the most intense witch hunting. This argument's not been without its critics, and it's certainly not perfect. For example, there are some areas in Germany, such as the electoral Palatinate, which also suffered from these extreme weather events, but didn't prosecute loads of witches. So there's not necessarily a causal link there. But the comparison of the two different countries that I'm doing here, I think, offers the opportunity to explore Behringer's argument about the significance of witchcraft and weather further. Did German and English contemporaries make the same links between witchcraft and weather, or did their opinions on this matter differ? So, as I've already mentioned, several German preachers chose to address this question of the efficacy of weather magic in their sermons. One of the earliest printed sermons to address this topic was by Johannes Brentz, a Protestant reformer in the Duchy of Württemberg. He preached his sermon on thunder, hailstorms and tempests in 1539, and it was subsequently printed in both Latin and German. Brentz claimed that it was popularly believed that witches could create storms, and it was also popularly believed that to prevent these storms, witches needed to be hunted down and executed. Such a belief was, in his view, not only misguided, but downright idolatrous. Brentz emphasised that storms were sent solely by God as a punishment for mankind's crimes and sins. He criticised the notion that the devil or witches wielded any real power over the natural world, and stressed God's omnipotence. Brentz's approach proved popular with other theologians, and his argument was repeated in sermons by other preachers, including Matthäus Alba and Wilhelm Biedenbach, Jacob Heerbrand, Paul Jenisch, and Johann Georg Sigwart. But in some German witchcraft sermons, there was evidently a tension between this providential worldview that was advocated by some Protestant preachers and this perception that the devil's influence and the dangers of witchcraft were increasing. This conflict led to what Hans Christian Erik Middelfart has termed a jungle of contradictory theories, where some preachers simultaneously emphasized the ultimate power of God and subscribed to the reality of the threat posed by witches. Jacob Greta, a preacher in Schwäbisch Hall, Baden-Württemberg, asserted that the devil and witches could do nothing without God's permission. But whereas Brents considered witches to be utterly powerless and merely deceived by the devil into thinking that they had power to create storms that really they had nothing to do with, Greater's sermon suggested that witches could, and indeed did, wreak havoc if God allowed it. Joachim Zehner, a preacher in Schleusingen, Thüringen, also trod a fine line between God's ultimate authority and the ability of the devil and witches to create storms. Witches and weather continued to plague preachers well into the 17th century. Bernhard Waldschmidt, a preacher in Frankfurt am Main, addressed the question in his collection of 28 sermons on witches and spectres, which was printed in 1660. He essentially agreed with Brents that witches were duped by the devil about the extent of their powers, but then he also suggested that with the assistance of the devil, witches could perform real harm. So I think what I'm trying to emphasize here is that this is an ongoing debate, and it's not something that ever really gets resolved, but it's something that people continue to be interested in throughout the period. How did attitudes in England compare? According to Keith Thomas, witchcraft was very seldom invoked in England to explain bad weather in the way that was so common on the continent. Yet when we turn to examine English religious tracts on the subject of witchcraft, it's clear that debates about weather magic were not confined to Germany. George Gifford, preacher in Malden, Essex, wrote in one of his 2 tracts discussing witchcraft that the blind multitude mistakenly believed many things about the ability of witches. Amongst these misguided beliefs was the suggestion that witches had the power to raise winds and tempests. Gifford's viewpoint on this matter is very similar to the providential viewpoint put forward by German theologians like Brents. Drawing from scripture, Gifford denied that there was any biblical evidence that witches were capable of such things, and argued that these witches needed to be punished not because of the harm that they inflicted, but because of their association with the devil. Once again, however, this proved controversial. Several English preachers asserted that weather magic was in fact a reality. In the dialogue written by Henry Holland, a Cambridge minister, 2 characters discuss the belief that witches can raise tempests. Whilst one dismisses this as the vain surmises of credulous and foolish people, the other convinces him that, in fact, there is ample evidence that witches can perform such acts in the Bible and in history. In fact, he claimed that this is the confession of witches of all times, nations, and people, reflecting the belief that weather magic was a widespread practice. William Perkins, also a Cambridge clergyman, likewise agreed that witches had the ability to create storms in the Bible, and that contemporary witches possessed these same abilities. Alexander Roberts, a preacher in Norfolk, stated that it was common knowledge that witches did have the ability to raise storms because of the diabolic pact that they'd made. So in fact, if anything, these preachers and these examples are more credulous about the ability of witches to create storms than their German counterparts were. I think it's also notable that both German and English preachers agreed that belief in the efficacy of weather magic was widespread and popularly held. Whether the preachers themselves believed in it or not, they frequently claimed that the reason they needed to discuss weather magic at all was because of its popularity amongst the populace at large. So the question I now want to ask is this actually an accurate reflection of popular beliefs? But then looking at popular beliefs is quite a difficult thing to do. But I do think that these news reports can offer some way of exploring the broader popularity of weather magic and how this weather magic fed into witchcraft prosecutions. These reports are generally less abstract and theoretical than the sermons or the tracts because they reported real trials, or at least they claimed to report real trials. Some of them didn't, but that's not something I've got time to go into now, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A if anyone wants to. In Germany, news reports indicate that weather magic was an intrinsic component of witchcraft beliefs and often formed the basis of allegations. Abigail Warfield explored witchcraft news reports in her PhD thesis, and she devoted a whole chapter to weather magic precisely because it's such a ubiquitous theme in these reports. As she highlights, accusations that witches have conjured up devastating storms were present in some of the earliest reports, such as this one from 1563, and remained a feature of some of the last printed reports on this subject, such as this broadsheet from 1669. If we take the German witchcraft pamphlets as a whole, there are several key features that emerge in their discussion of weather magic. The first point to make is that overall, these pamphlets are not questioning the reality of weather magic in the way that these preachers were. Whilst many of these reports do include the phrase "with God's permission," which does reflect the belief that God was the person who held the ultimate power over deciding when and where there were going to be these storms, there's very little to suggest that the witches themselves were not ultimately responsible for the storms, and I would say that these pamphleteers on the whole are assigning far more power and agency to the witches than the preachers did. Some didn't even mention God or the devil at all, such as a pamphlet printed in 1587, which claimed that the witches had created multiple storms to devastate crops out of sheer malice. Another recurring aspect of these reports is their emphasis on the scale of devastation caused. And many of them, particularly those printed in the 1580s and 90s, included long lists of places that had been damaged by storms and then connected these storms to witch burning. So the example I've given on the slide here is fairly typical, and what happens is usually these pamphlets begin with a list of places and dates where these storms have happened. They describe the damage, and then they move on to discuss witch burnings, which is what's happening in the last paragraph that I've highlighted there. I think these examples fit really well with Beringer's argument that weather magic and witch hunting were connected in the views of contemporaries, certainly at least in Central Europe. If we turn to look at English witchcraft reports, however, we can see that the picture differs significantly. Charlotte Rose Miller, who's done an analysis of English witchcraft reports throughout the period of witch hunting, does not address weather magic at all, and that's really unsurprising because there's almost no reference to it in the English reports. It is, however, not wholly absent. Two pamphlets from 1645 refer to accusations of raising storms. The first one is a group of accused witches who confess to creating storms to wreak havoc on buildings and crops, and this example I think is very similar to the German reports of weather magic. The other one, however, is much smaller scale, and it concerns just one victim and one perpetrator. It's notable as well that both of these pamphlets were printed during a peak in witch hunting between 1645 and 1647, and they may be considered therefore somewhat atypical of the other witchcraft reports and beliefs that we see. However, another report can be found in 1682 of three witches who were put on trial, and one of the things they were accused of was causing several ships to sink. And I think the implication here is that these ships were sunk by a storm that they've created. So I think we can say that weather magic may have been a concept that some people were familiar with in England, but it definitely wasn't a regular feature of these reports, and it doesn't seem to have been anywhere near as popular as it was in Germany. It's also significant that in two of these three cases, the accused witches denied that they were guilty of the charge, and that also that this denial has been printed, whereas in Germany, the witches are portrayed as often gleefully admitting their role in creating these storms. I think it's an interesting contrast in the portrayal of the witches here. Additionally, the damage caused by weather magic in these examples is less focused on crop damage and agriculture and more on disasters at sea, which perhaps reflects differences in the cultural significance of weather in these two countries and how it impacted on people's daily lives. So to quickly sum up, or attempt to, this paper has demonstrated the value of exploring weather magic as an insight into wider demonological debates on the nature and extent of witches' power. By comparing German and English printed sermons and tracts, we can see that there was a significant overlap in their discussion of the existence and efficacy of weather magic. There was no clear consensus in either country, but the continued debate in both countries is indicative of a broader Protestant demonological thought which was developing and which was transcending national borders. If anything, English preachers were more credulous about the existence of weather magic than their German counterparts. This seems to be particularly surprising when we turn to examine the news reports in each country, where there is a clear distinction between the regularity of weather magic in German witchcraft reports and the rarity in the English equivalents. The contrast between what preachers claimed was happening and what the pamphlets show is a reminder that claims about popular belief always need to be treated with caution. The stark differences between German and English pamphleteers' references to weather magic does lend some weight to Beringer's argument about the connection between weather, witchcraft, and witch hunting. To explore this idea further and to consider the cultural connection between witchcraft and weather more, I think it would be interesting to look at printed sources that are just reporting on extreme weather events more generally, to see whether witchcraft and sorcery or any of these kind of explanations are coming up elsewhere, or if they're just limited to these witchcraft reports, which I think would be an interesting thing to look at. It's not something that I've been able to do in this paper today, but I hope what I have done has been interesting to you, and thank you very much for listening. And this is just the references as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Natalie, for that. We'll give us a round of applause. Thank you. It's so interesting, isn't it? Even between sort of, we think of European witchcraft, I think, but those such stark extremes, particularly in the execution figures you gave at the start, but also kind of just, you know, the relationship between sort of ideas about witchcraft, and particularly with religion as well. It's really, really interesting. We tend to just do English witchcraft. So yeah, your comparative studies get really good, interesting insights. So. We will go straight on now to Hannah's paper. As I say, we'll do both papers and then give time for questions at the end. Hannah completed her undergraduate degree here at UEA, but she's now at the University of Sheffield, where she studied her master's and has gone on to do a PhD. She's currently in her third year, and she researches animal encounters documented in English voyage narratives between 1550 and 1630. And she's particularly interested in seeing how human-animal interactions can be used as a lens to view aspects of maritime society. So, over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, and also thank you for having me, and a brilliant talk, Natalie. There were so many interesting things there. I'll just see if I can get my PowerPoint up. Can we see my slides?
Yes, you're good to go. Yeah.
So I can't see any of you, so I'm just talking at the screen. So yes, I'm here to talk about animals, hunting and identity in Job Hortop's Rare Travels. If any of you saw the initial flyers, my title has changed slightly. I apologise, but I started writing about this source and just could not stop. So I'm here to show you why I found it so interesting, really. So Job Hortop, he was born in Lincolnshire, and he trained as a powder maker before joining the crew of Captain John Hawkins in 1567. He joined the crew of the Jesus of Lubeck, which is the ship depicted on the left. And he worked as a gunner during the voyage, which was particularly infamous. So just to cover what happened, Captain Hawkins had been trading slaves and provisions with the Spanish colonies in New Spain. And during his third expedition, on his way to Florida, the fleet met a disastrous storm and were forced to take shelter at the nearest port, which was Veracruz, depicted on the right. Also at Veracruz was the new Viceroy of New Spain, who was charged with putting a stop to English trade, and so an attack was launched. Job Hortop was one of the men who was able to escape. However, some of the ships did not make it, and so those that managed to get out were badly damaged, short of supplies, and overcrowded with the men who were able to escape. This led to some disastrous conditions where men were forced to eat the exotic animals they captured, such as parrots and monkeys. And to quote John Hawkins' account in Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, hides were thought very good meat. Rats, cats, mice and dogs, none escaped that might be gotten. So some quite horrific conditions there. They reached land off the coast of Mexico and decided that there's obviously not enough provisions to get all the way back to England, so half of the men would have to be left. John Hawkins, who was obviously the captain, so he sailed home, made it back, and continued to have a prosperous career in England. However, Job Hortop, who was left in Mexico, did not return to England until 23 years later, and he wrote up his account in a surprisingly short 19-page narrative, so not even a page a year. But the reason I've decided to talk to you about Job Hortop and his short account is because it includes what I think are some of the most interesting exotic animal encounters of the period. As you'll see, he purposely characterized the animals that he encounters as antagonists to emphasize themes of bravery and success in an ultimately unsuccessful voyage account. To open his narrative, he states that, to quote, "Many of us, though to our general's great grief, were constrained to be set on shore, since which time I have passed sundry perils in the wilderness and escaped many dangers, wherein my life often stood in great hazard, yet by the providence of God preserved." Effectively, what Hortop constructed was a tale of God's blessing over the English countrymen as they bravely encountered and subdued the wilderness. Although the Spanish did successfully attack them, Hortop offers a story of his survival and uses animal encounters to showcase England's rightful assertion over the natural world. So before the voyage was actually attacked, Hortop sets the scene for his account by illustrating the danger they faced in the wilderness. Before reaching South America, the fleet sailed the coast of Western Africa in search of slaves. Arriving in Sierra Leone, Hortop and some of the other men were ordered to sail upriver, where they encountered one of the most dangerous animals in Africa, hippos, or what they called at the time seahorses, rather similar animals. So on the left here we have an image of a seahorse or hippo, which is in Topsell's History of the Four-Footed Beast, and he is eating a very rigid crocodile. But Hortop wrote, "The same night we had one of our pinnaces bulged by a seahorse, and thereby our men thrown overboard, yet saved by means of swimming to the other pinnaces, except only 2 of our men, who holding fast by another, carried away by the same seahorse, who did eat them." An unfortunate end. But immediately, readers get a sense for the dangerous wildlife Hortop and the other seafarers were encountering during their voyage. These expeditions were life-threatening, and exotic animals were sometimes the killers. However, Hortop's narrative is a survival story, and so it's not long before he documented instances where he and the other men overcame and even dominated the natural world. So after crossing the Atlantic, the crew have a more successful encounter with a monstrous crocodile in the River Hatch. He writes, "7 of us went in a pinnace up into the river, carrying with us a dog, until whom, with rope yarn, we bound a great hook of steel with a chain that had a swivel, which we put under the dog's belly, the point of the hook coming over his back fast bound, as aforesaid. We put him overboard and veered out our rope by little and little, rowing away with our boat. The lagarto, which is a crocodile, came and presently swallowed up the dog. Then did we row hard till we had choked him. He plunged and made a wonderful stir in the water. We leapt on shore and hailed him on land." To both the contemporary and the modern eye, this is quite a shocking and rather exciting account. In many ways, it's a complete contrast to the contemporary hunting traditions of England. Rather than using man's domestic dogs to aid in the hunt, the dog is used as bait and sacrificed by its own masters. The prey is also not a conventional animal. Rather than a large deer chased down by a hunting party, the prey is a dangerous carnivore, which the longer quote on my presentation, a 23-foot dangerous carnivore who is technically hunting them, or rather their dog. While there's no doubt that hunting in England could be a dangerous sport, it pales in comparison to the risk that Hortop and 6 other men willingly took in order to catch one exotic animal. This anecdote, whether entirely true or not, was clearly intended to demonstrate the bravery and the strength of the English sailors, while also providing the reader with some entertainment. Hunting was a significant part of voyaging and an equally important part of voyage narratives. The way prey animals were characterised in retellings purposely reflected upon the hunter, author and their countrymen. In England, one of the main appeals of hunting was the chase. Although the practice was very regimented in tradition, the unpredictability of the prey animal provided an intoxicating rush that gripped the upper classes. However, for seafarers, the context of hunting was very different. Animals could be hunted for many reasons, whether it's for food or more often than not sport, but the act was a lot less restricted by traditions. Moreover, the combination of both exotic animals and a foreign landscape often resulted in a more eclectic style of hunting, with very creative methods that were sometimes reminiscent of just outright slaughter. Penguins, for example, would be herded into a circle, brutally beaten to death, and even the men who were hunting them had considerations as to whether they should be classed as actual hunting. For this slide, I picked these images just because I find them really interesting. So on the left, this comes from Andrei Thevet's cosmography, and it depicts crocodile hunting in the Nile. And you can see actually there's no dogs, but there is a crocodile with a rope in his mouth. He's clearly been hooked. So they're clearly using a very similar method to what Hortop must have used, where you then drag the crocodile out and stab/beat it to death. And then on the other side, we have Theodore de Bray's Native Americans hunting an alligator. More include this just to show, again, the sheer size of some of these beasts and the brutality involved in killing them. Which brings me nicely onto Marcus Rediker, a very prominent maritime historian. Talking about the 18th century, he's identified danger as being one of the most distinct influences on maritime culture. And I argue that it was equally influential in the late 16th century. As we can see from Hortop's account, danger was at the heart of the two animal encounters already described, though in very different ways. When in Africa, the danger of wild animals was emphasised when two men were taken and eaten by hippos. However, by the time we get to the crocodile, there is a more distinct lack of fear for these exotic beasts. Arguably just as dangerous as a hippo, Hortop and his crew purposely seek out the crocodile and willingly put their lives at risk in hopes of securing its carcass. There are many things that can be said about what this encounter reveals about the individuals, which is another part of my research, which is also equally interesting. But by examining the collective identity that Hortop is clearly trying to create with this account, we can see what was considered important qualities for the English in the wider world during the period of exploration and colonisation. What Hortop and other voyage accounts show us is that the importance of animal encounters is not necessarily in the defeat of the animal, but in the fearlessness of the crew who face them. So I'll introduce you to another man. We have Richard Jobson. He explored the River Gambia in 1620, and he equally used themes of danger in animal encounters to comment upon national identity. But with a longer voyage narrative, he does this a lot more obviously. Although the title of this talk specifically states I'll be looking at hunting narratives, hunting is not actually the most important element. Whether an animal was killed or not is not essential to depict superiority of the wilderness. And Jobson's account is full of instances of comparison between English and Indigenous peoples, building upon the identity of his crew and nationality. One stark instance is in the lack of fear he had for crocodiles when the men needed to enter the river to aid one of their boats. So he wrote, "I could not make any of my black people go out of the boat, denying flatly to go into the water, saying that Bumbo, which was their term for crocodile, would have them. After some 2 of these passages, there was another strait where was a necessity of more hands, so that stripping myself, I leapt into the water." After Jobson took the lead, his Indigenous travellers followed him into the water, considering that the white man shined more in the water than they did, and therefore if Bumbo came, he would surely take them first, which I think is brilliant logic. So we can see through this that physical dominion of animals was not always necessary in seafarer accounts to demonstrate superiority. Rather, a lack of fear displayed the same level of strength, bravery, and national prowess, which is what Jobson used to construct both his national identity and, to an extent, his personal identity as well. Interestingly, right before Hortop's crocodile hunt, he described a hostile human encounter. So upon arriving at the river, they came across an island kept by the Spaniards, who shot at Hortop and the crew. After some back and forth, Hortop's general arrived and, to quote, valiantly took the town with the loss of one man named Thomas Surgeon. It's no coincidence that these two events are described in the same paragraph. Evidently, Hortop wanted to depict the English as conquerors over both the Spanish and the natural world. Using both brains and brawn, the crew were able to best both the Spanish and the wild carnival in a display of superiority, and they did it without fear. Themes of bravery and English success continue throughout Hortop's narrative. Who can guess what next animal I'm going to be talking about now? So on the way to Plasencia, I think it's pronounced. This is still before the Spanish attack, but we're now in Southern America. Hortop and a few other crew members found a monstrous venomous worm with 2 heads. His body was as big as a man's arm and a yard long. The unusual and dangerous worm was then swiftly killed by Master Robert Barrett with his sword. To add to the mythical terror of the 2-headed beast, its body began to leak black blood as if it were coloured with ink. Additionally, in Santa Martha, 2 of his crewmates killed another monstrous snake, which was slithering towards his cave with a coney in his mouth. Identified as an adder, the snake was as big as any man's thigh and 7 foot long. Upon his tail he had 16 knots, every one as big as a great walnut. Upon killing and opening up the adder, 2 more conies were found. Just like the crocodile, both these snakes were clearly representative of the larger American wilderness. And just like the Spanish, Hortop framed these animals as antagonists in his narrative. As each dangerous beast was defeated, the wilderness was increasingly conquered. Furthermore, Hortop and the other men were shown to embody the desirable traits of bravery, strength, and fierceness, asserting England's rightful claim over the wider world. Given the humiliating attack on the fleet at Port Veracruz, it's unsurprising that Hortop constructed his narrative in order to display the prowess and strength of Englishmen before their demise. Yet exotic animals were more than just antagonists to any good voyage narrative. They were physical beings which men encountered and interacted with. The captured crocodile in Hortop's narrative was actually stuffed with straw to be brought back to England as a trophy. However, it was lost during the Spanish attack. The use of animals to construct identity went further than their characterization in accounts, as their bodies were often brought back to England as prized trophies of human dominion and English success. So on to elephants now. On the left, I'm not really sure what the rhinos are doing, but we have, I think this is also from Andre Vervet's, I didn't write it down, work, but if you can see, there is a man in the tree with a bow and arrow, and this is how some indigenous people hunted, is that they would shoot the elephant with a poisoned arrow or javelin. It's actually described in Richard Jobson's account. Wait for the elephant to collapse, and then they'll go in and cut out the poisoned meat, and then you have an elephant carcass. And then on the right, I just wanted to include a skull, so you can really see the sheer size of these animals, and this isn't even probably the biggest one out there. But there's a man called Robert Gainch, and he is the probable author of John Locke's voyage narrative to Guinea. And he gives a wonderful description of an elephant skull that was brought back to England. So he wrote, "At this last voyage was brought from Guinea the head of an elephant of such huge bigness that only the bones or cranny thereof, besides the nether jaw and great turks, weighed about 200 weight, with all the flesh, brains, and skin, with all other parts belonging to the whole head. In my judgment, it could weigh less than 500 weight. This head divers have seen in the house of the worthy merchant Sir Andrew Judd, where also I saw it and beheld it, not only with my bodily eyes, but much more with the eyes of my mind and spirit, considering by the work the cunning and wisdom of the workmaster, without which consideration the sight of such strange and wonderful things may rather seem curiosities than profitable contemplations. And there's a lot that can be taken from this account, but just to really focus in, the skull's presence on Judd's wall fits with the human dominion narrative present in the animal encounters of both Hortop and Jobson's voyage account, and many other voyage accounts that I've looked at as well. Even today, people place a large amount of significance on preserved animal bodies, whether they're considered collections, trophies, or reminders, as some people have taxidermied pets. But to have such a large remnant of an animal in the home of Andrew Judd would undoubtedly serve first and foremost as a reminder of his wealth to both himself and his visitors. Moreover, the elephant would have represented its exotic home, which, after death, reflects and emphasizes the exoticism of Judd's lifestyle and his house. If it wasn't lost at sea, Hortop's crocodile would have had the same fate as a trophy in someone's collection. Historiography of English deer hunting has highlighted the importance of large prey animals to their owners, both dead and alive. Whether they were preserved on a wall or offered at the dinner table, the owner's possession of the carcass communicated clear messages of superiority to both their society and in the larger chain of being and natural order. Outside of voyage narratives, animal bodies continued to aid displays of power and status as communication pieces for the more wealthy in society. So I hope after this sort of brief introduction to my research in these sources, you can kind of see that Hortop's account is an absolutely fascinating concoction of danger, adventure, and success in a voyage that was ultimately a disaster. Through animal encounters and hunting narratives, Hortop exaggerated the fearlessness of the crew's identity to imply an English right to the wider world and recover the reputation of the voyage. By demonstrating skill and strength, Englishmen were able to conquer even the most monstrous of beasts. Furthermore, the animal role in identity construction did not end with accounts of their demise. Rather, for the most impressive of prey, their bodies were retained as trophies, forever representing the power, wealth, and exoticism of its owner and their nation. Exotic animals were therefore extremely important aspects of identity construction during the early Atlantic period. Present at multiple societal levels, animals were used by literate seafarers to construct and shape voyage narratives, and then their bodies could then later be absorbed into the wealthier levels of English society as depictions of both personal and national prowess. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for that. Thank you. What an incredibly vivid account of sort of interactions with all sorts of exotic beasts. It's incredible, isn't it? I really wish there was so much more we knew about this. I've never come across anyone studying it before, so it's really, really interesting. Wow. Thank you.
Watch this space.
Watch this space, exactly, definitely. I'd be delighted to take questions now for both of our speakers. We can welcome Natalie back as well. As I said to, Lucy says she's clapping. As I said to the online group, please do feel free to type questions that you've got into the chat box and I can read those out to our speakers. Online group in the room, sorry, we've tried this before. If you speak as loud as you can, we can pick you up on the monitor and our guests should be able to hear you as well. I'll just give people a bit of time to do some typing. I'd like to kick us off with a question to Hannah. I'm really interested in this idea about animal trophies, as well, because that's something that I think we always think of Victorian explorers, you know, bedecking their house in stuffed animals. And I guess I'm kind of interested in at what point do you think the kind of the market for exotic homeware, if you like, starts to pick up? Is this something we see already, or are you having to be? It has to be something you've killed in order to prove, you know, it's your own. Is there a trade in that going on already, I guess, as well?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done too much research on the actual like commodical trade going on back in England. that's something that I'll certainly be coming to later, but it definitely seems to be a thing. And you got all sorts of, I've read an article about they would like sew taxidermied animals together to make hydras and all sorts of wondrous beasts. So certainly back in England, for people that weren't necessarily sailing and voyaging, it's, yeah, some people were buying these animals and weren't necessarily concerned whether they were realistic or not, which is really interesting, something I want to look into more. But in terms of the actual men on board, yeah, this has been going on for a while. There's not lots of evidence, unfortunately, but there's a wonderful account in a private diary where he talks about one of his crewmates who takes a turtle and then just says, I don't care whether the captain doesn't want me to have it, I'm taking it, no matter what. And unfortunately, we don't get to find out what happened to this turtle, but like these men are taking things left, right, and centre. So it's really interesting to look into it more.
Yeah. It's really interesting to give agency back to sort of the lower shipmates, I suppose, as well. I think we always think of the sea captains as, yeah, leading those journeys and making all the decisions about what we're taking. And yeah, of course, you're going to be interested, aren't you, if you're off on your voyages and you're part of it. We've got a question for Natalie, is coming from Lucy. Lucy asks, do you see a gendered component in witch/weather narratives, especially in Germany, where, and she says, I think there were proportionally more male witches than there were in England?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. That is a good question and not one that I've actually looked at. I mean, my impression, especially of the weather magic in German sources, is that it's usually carried out by large groups of witches, so there's no mention of the gender either way. So it could be that there are men involved, but I wouldn't say there's like a specific association with women or men. But you are right that there are more men involved in witchcraft generally in Germany, and it varies quite a lot. It's about 80% overall in Germany, but then some areas more like 75% women. So it varies, whereas in England it's more around like 90% women, which is quite high actually if you're looking at Europe as a whole. So yeah, but thank you, it's interesting. I'll look at it more. Thanks.
Yeah, Lucy says she didn't think about the group angle, so that's interesting. That is, as far as I know about sort of English witchcraft accusations, they're quite sort of individual named sort of targeted things. So to have, yeah, that group accusation is really, really interesting. Yeah. Question in the room from Ollie.
Thank you to both. They were both very interesting papers. Questions for both, but I'll start with Hannah. On sort of mythical and fantastical creatures, things such as the kraken and the unicorn, are these sort of common currency amongst these sailors and these explorers? Are they aware of these ideas? Do they ever go out looking specifically for these types of creatures?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately I have no answer for krakens, which I really wish I did. But unicorns is really interesting because there seems to be different types of unicorns all over the world at this point, and the most common ones is narwhals, and they do hunt some, but not very much. They're quite obscure creatures to find. But yeah, there's quite a few accounts of them seeing dead narwhals washed up and their horns. There's a really interesting one written, it's from Martin Frobisher's Voyage, where they find a broken narwhal horn. And they mention that when you drop a spider in it, I think they said it dies. And I haven't really worked out what that means, but there's definitely a connection to some sort of magical power with it, which is absolutely fascinating. And yeah, they do collect the horns, just obviously they're massive, so you can't really keep them for personal use. You bring them back and give them to your queen.
Thank you. Any others? Yeah, Jared.
So I've got a question for Natalie, and one of the things I was really struck by was the sheer difference in the level of death between England and Germany. And one of the things that got me thinking about that was how, forgive me if I'm ignorant of German history here, but how involved were the German authorities or state or local nobility? How much were they involved in the process at all? Because 25,000 over that period is quite a lot, and I can't imagine it would escape their notice. Were they kind of encouraging it, or were they against it at all?
Yeah, thank you. That, I mean, it's a great question. It's probably a separate paper on its own, but yeah, I mean, this is 25,000 legal executions. So there may have been other people who were killed in sort of lynch mobs, I suppose, but that's not what we're looking at in these statistics. So this is people who were tried and found guilty of witchcraft and executed, and the authorities were playing a big role in some cases. But the thing with Germany especially is that, like, you've got some territories, particularly in the southwest, where the prince bishops have a lot of political and a lot of religious power, and they're combining these, and you've got the confessionalization going on. So this attempt to purify our territory versus someone else's territory, and one of the ways that they do that is they hunt witches, and that's some of the locations where you get the biggest witch trials, such as the Electorate of Trier. That's because of some drive for reform. So the authorities are definitely involved in that. But then once you get these big trials that really kind of spiral out of control, you then get people who are in positions of authority being drawn into the trials and tried as witches themselves. So eventually these massive trials kind of wear themselves out because they've prosecuted everyone and they've not got any money left to do it anymore. But then in other areas where there was much more centralized control, you could kind of rein in these trials and stop them from spiraling, which is why you get some areas that really didn't prosecute many witches at all, and other areas where thousands of people died. Appealing to the imperial court as well was another way that you could try and sort of restrict it. So yeah, it's complicated. The authorities were involved in some places and trying to restrict it in others. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that answered that.
Natalie?
Another question for Natalie. You sort of mentioned there, has any attempt ever been made to map where these pamphlets are made and whether or not there's any sort of correlations between geographic components? Are they close to rivers? Are they close to mountains? Are they coastal? That sort of thing. I like to put things on maps so I can then look at them. So what has it been attempted, or could it be?
Thank you. I love that question because that's what I'm doing in my next chapter. So yeah, locating witchcraft is like the final section of my thesis, and what I've already done is map where the pamphlets were printed, which actually doesn't correspond to where the trials that they're talking about happened. So you've already got a separation. But in terms of what you're saying about, like, are they close to rivers? Are they close to mountains? Borderlands, yeah, it's like a really big thing for these trials, and an association with mountainous regions is something that comes up time and time again in these pamphlets. And usually that's, you know, the large groups of witches will travel to a mountain and they'll have a big party, and they'll worship the devil a bit, and then they'll conjure up a storm. So they're all like linked together. So yeah, I don't think it's happened yet. I'm hoping it hasn't happened yet, but I am hoping to do it. So yeah, thank you.
We've got any questions from the online group as well. You can type them in and I can read them out for you. We'll go back to Jared again.
I've got a question for Hannah. One of the things that you mentioned was that the purpose of many of the accounts that were written by sailors was essentially to bring about the idea of English superiority, or the kind of conquering over nature. One question I've got is, how successful were they necessarily? Did people really latch onto these accounts and hold them up as kind of exemplar texts of that kind of thing, or did they kind of go unnoticed, or how impactful were they in general?
That is a really good question, and not one I particularly have a complete answer to, because I focus mainly on what they're writing about than necessarily the impact of it. But I do know a lot of these accounts were written to justify the voyages. Certainly initially like a lot of it was private investment. So certainly for the country and for the monarchy, there wasn't that much interest in it. So you kind of have to justify a reason for going out. And obviously with Job Hortop having such a disastrous voyage, you definitely need to justify that. So I can't really give you a clear answer, but I would like to think, just considering the voyaging continued and colonization happened, that they must have been impactful in some way in how they at least managed to justify the sort of worthwhileness of going out, and able to sort of create this image that, you know, we can go out and we can actually conquer, colonize, and get beneficial resources from these places.
Thank you.
I have a question for both of you, which is convenient given the time period you're discussing. How much potential crossover there is in ideas? How much does weather play an impact on the sailing accounts? Are there any sort of ideas of witches' association with beasts that is also associated with poor weather at the same time?
Who wants to go first?
You go first, Hannah.
Yeah, weather is a massive thing, because certainly, you know, it can be life and death, particularly with storms, but weather also massively influences the voyage itself in terms of what they eat and how they perceive the environment that they're in. So sort of the humoral theory obviously massively influences the body, and temperature is one of the big things that does that. So when they're in the north, they eat, or at least try to eat, quite differently to how they're in when they're in the southern Atlantic, in terms of times of day and necessarily what they're eating. But also the north, and certainly like the Arctic areas, I find particularly fascinating, because a lot of the men hate it because it's just, it is grey, it is cold, there is barely any life there, and they encounter these Inuit people who are just eating raw meat, and it's just all horrifically shocking. So they see it as a very like uninhabitable, wild place, and a lot of it is because of the climate that they're in. Whereas when you come down towards Africa and the southern Atlantic, you know, there's abundance because of the tropical rainforests and all the different types of climates that you get, that like there's so many more animals, there's so many more plants, there's so much more for them to experience, that it's so much more exciting and more profitable in a lot of ways, just because of the environment that they're encountering.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, the question, beasts, witchcraft, yes. Yes, and I was really interested in what Hannah was talking about, because yeah, I just like these mythical beasts. Someone I know is looking at dragons in early modern German culture, and I thought there's quite a connection there, so that's interesting. Animals generally do play a big role in witchcraft. English witchcraft, some of you probably will know, you've got the idea of the witch's familiar, which is usually a cat or a dog or a rat or something like that. And that's an idea, that's the familiar is seen as being quite an uniquely English phenomenon, but actually in my research, I don't agree with that. I think there are similar things you can find in Germany, and a few of the German pamphlets talk about a raven that is basically, I think, performing the same role as a familiar. So they help in the performance of witchcraft, not necessarily specifically associated with weather. In terms of associations between animals and weather and witches, the only thing that really springs to mind is the use of animal body parts and human body parts to create potions that they then used to create the storm. I think in one of the images I showed, there's two witches putting a snake and a frog into a cauldron, and then they're creating the storm above them. And there's some descriptions of these potions using, like, yeah, snakes, pretty common, frogs, spider webs, I think, as well, is something that gets thrown in there. So yeah, there's definitely a connection between the animal world and the magical witchy world. So yeah, it was really interesting to hear what Hannah's doing as well. Very cool.
Good pairing in the seminar lineup, I think. Yeah. A question for Natalie. I guess I'm kind of interested, although you've said it's so hard to prove how sort of widely held beliefs were about sort of witchcraft and weather, but they definitely seem to be part of popular culture, for want of a better word, don't they? I just wondered how long these kind of beliefs sort of stay part of culture, really, especially in Germany, where it seems a lot stronger. Is there any kind of sense of, I imagine in Enlightenment, when you get more understanding of sort of, you know, science and weather and things, that it might die off, but is that the case, or?
That's a really interesting question, and not one that I feel like I can answer. I mean, the ideas that storms are natural and that they're created by sort of changes in the pressure and stuff, that's something that it does come out in the weather pamphlets that I've seen already. So it's not an idea that's kind of alien to people in the early modern period. But then, yeah, I think it's just really difficult to tell, because these, for example, these sermons keep talking about weather magic as if it's like this big thing, but then how far is that actually a reflection of what people are thinking, and how far is that these preachers being like, oh, this other person wrote about weather and witchcraft, so I should also do that. So it's difficult to know whether this is like an echo chamber or whether it is genuinely reflecting what people believed in. But there's definitely a continuance in Germany, for example, of the idea of ringing the church bells to ward off storms and devils, and that's something that continues in Protestant territories. Protestant reformers try to get rid of it, see it as a superstitious practice, but it carries on throughout the early modern period. So yeah, I would imagine these ideas probably do stick around, and it'd be very interesting to look into further. It's not something I've really looked at, so thank you.
Any more questions from the room?
I had a question for Natalie. I'm sorry if you've not looked into this. You kind of only briefly mentioned it, but it picked my ears up. You said in England there wasn't as much focus on weather magic, but there was accounts of blaming witches for ships getting lost at sea. And I was just wondering if there was any indication whether it was the witches affecting the sea, which would obviously be quite similar to weather magic in the natural realm, or whether they were affecting the ships, which is quite a bit different.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think in one of the cases, I think it's that they've affected the sea, but in the other one, it doesn't really, it just says that they're responsible for sinking several ships, which I've taken to be that they've like stirred up poor conditions, but you could be right that it's completely different and it's just talking about the ships themselves, but it's not something that's like very common in these pamphlets, although it might be more common than I think. I'll have to look into it more, but thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Thank you.
All right. Well, if anyone else has got any questions online, please type them now. If not, I will thank you again, and we'll give another round of applause to our speakers, please. Thank you. And yeah, thank you so much for providing such an entertaining end to our seminar series this year. I will just share one last slide before we go. So if you've enjoyed the seminar series this year, and again, thank you ever so much for everyone who's supported it, and we've got a lot of regular viewers and a lot of regular attendees. If you want to contribute next year, our call for papers went live last week. Please do send me your topics to my email address, which is l.crawley@uea.ac.uk. If you're at UEA, you'll have got this on your emails, but I also we publicise stuff on Twitter as well, so please keep a lookout for us there. Beyond that, I just want to say a massive thank you again to Hannah and Natalie for interesting topics, and I look forward to seeing everyone again in 2022. So thank you so much, and I will end the recording.
Thank you, Louise.